Welcome to This Week in Racing. I'm David Land. We've got some huge stuff to talk about this week. There's been some high-profile firings, some high-profile hirings, some high-profile retirements, some big business moves potentially being made behind the scenes of major racing series here in the United States. And we're going to have to be talking about, or at least get the conversation started once again, about guaranteed spots in the Indianapolis 500. So it's a packed episode today, so let's get into it straight away with some big news that broke this morning. And that is that Sebastien Bourdais has been fired from Dale Coyne Racing. He will not contest the 2020 NTT IndyCar Series with the team. Now, funding issues had been cited in the initial report from Racer.com and were eventually fleshed out a bit more by the Associated Press's Jenna Fryer, who mentioned that Honda pulled the funding out from Sebastien Bourdais and his program due to the fact that he did not manage to score any manufacturer's points in the championship. Now, the manufacturer's points for IndyCar are scored by having the top two cars from each manufacturer, and that's how points are determined. And Sebastien Bourdais throughout the entire season was not one of those cars at any point. That is Honda's reasoning behind it, apparently. So where does that leave Sebastien Bourdais? Well, he wasn't unemployed for very long. JDC Miller Motorsports in IMSA, which of course runs a Cadillac DPI, announced that he had been signed, Sebastien Bourdais, along with João Barbosa and Loic Duval, to pilot the car in the 2020 IMSA campaign. Now here's the question. Is Sebastien Bourdais going to make any IndyCar appearances this year? Will there be an Indy 500 ride? It seems like at this point that is very unlikely. The other question, of course, is who is going to take the seat at Dale Coyne Racing? Of course, there is now a funding issue, so you would assume that it's going to be a paid driver. Here's the other thing that comes out of this. What about Honda? Honda pulled funding. You would assume they have a budget for next year that has been set for quite a long time when talking about IndyCar spending. Could possibly that budget that was set aside to help Bourdais stay in the series, could that be moved to someone like James Hinchcliffe to help bridge the gap that's there with the funding that could potentially get him into a third Rahal seat, which was previously unattainable considering how much sponsorship money he has access to, or at least had access to prior to this move. There's going to be a lot of fallout from this, and we'll continue to talk about it as it develops. A pretty major industry move may be happening behind the scenes at NASCAR, as NBC Sports reports that Joe Gibbs is one of the entities that is bidding to build the Spec 2021 NASCAR chassis. Now, it needs to be noted right away that he is only one of multiple entities that are bidding on this potential building of the 2021 NASCAR car, including other team owners. But Joe Gibbs is the one that NBC Sports named, and thus he's the one we're going to focus on. Now, this is one of the big problems with Spec Racing and one of the reasons I'm against it. Unfortunately, what it creates a lot of times, and we're going to see it here with NASCAR, is it puts NASCAR in the situation of becoming a kingmaker. Who are they going to make incredibly wealthy for a long period of time? Because again, it appears that NASCAR is going to follow pretty closely with the IndyCar business model of Spec Racing, and that usually means the car is going to be in use for round about 10 years, maybe even more. Whomever gets the contract to build these cars, whether it's Joe Gibbs or anybody, is going to make an insane amount of money, and they're going to have exclusivity in the market, a monopoly on who gets to build the Cup Series race cars. And so I think it's a very slippery slope, whether it's Joe Gibbs, whether it's Rick Hendrick, whether it's anybody, though I think especially if it's Joe Gibbs, especially considering, I would say, the unpopularity of that team with the NASCAR fan base, especially considering their ties to a certain manufacturer, I think that this has a potential, especially if they choose Joe Gibbs to be exactly the thing that NASCAR doesn't need, or exactly the headline that NASCAR doesn't need going into 2021. Here's the other thing to consider as well. Let's say Joe Gibbs does get this 10-year contract. If someone like Joe Gibbs gets this insane amount of money from building all these race cars, guess what? NASCAR doesn't have a cost cap. So Joe Gibbs will be able to outspend his competition and figure out this spec car a heck of a lot quicker than even the most expensive teams in NASCAR. Again, it's not great if you pick someone from outside the sport like Dallara, but especially it would be a lot worse if they pick someone from inside the industry, because they've essentially given them the keys to the kingdom. And following up on something we got to talk about last week, it was confirmed this week that Rinus VeeKay has signed with Ed Carpenter Racing. It will be car number 21 and sponsored by Jumbo Supermarkets, a sponsor or a supermarket chain within the Netherlands, which usually supports Dutch drivers, and in fact, back in 2007 actually sponsored Robert Doornbos in the Champ Car World Series. Now, another part that came out when Rinus VeeKay was signed was the fact that, yes, indeed, Ed Carpenter had talked to Nico Hülkenberg, but unfortunately, they were unable to come to terms, and Nico Hülkenberg will not be in IndyCar racing next year. But the biggest silly season move of all is that Jimmie Johnson has announced that he will call it quits in the NASCAR Cup Series after 2020, after the 2020 season. Johnson has been one of the most prolific drivers of his era, scoring 7 NASCAR championships and a huge amount of wins. I think it's somewhere like 84. He's very high on the all-time win list. And Jimmie, man, this is something that I feel like, because there's a lot of stuff to talk about, because Jimmie's really the last of a certain era of NASCAR. I guess you could add Kurt Busch into that equation as well. But, I think it was Eric Estep that kind of mentioned it first, is that 2021 NASCAR is going to be completely removed from the era of Dale, I guess you could say. The era of NASCAR that virtually every fan has kind of become a fan of, it's almost pretty much going to be gone. NASCAR is going to be a completely different product from the standpoint of new drivers, new cars, new faces, new rules. And so that's an exciting prospect if you're a NASCAR fan. It's also a prospect that I think a lot of people are going to be biting their nails at, because of, we've seen over the last few years the decline in TV ratings, the decline in interest. Will there be a way to turn that around with a fresh new product? There's definitely that consideration. Jimmie Johnson, unfortunately, I think, speaking of those changes, I think Jimmie, he's definitely like a first ballot Hall of Famer. I'm not going to try to deny that. And I want to be very clear that I am not trying to diminish Jimmie Johnson's accomplishments in the sport. But I feel like a lot of the controversy surrounding stuff like the chase and the playoffs and stuff like that, I think will harm his legacy, or has already harmed it. I think many people look at that consecutive run of championships that he had and kind of brushes it off because of the fact that it was done under a chase system. And, that's unfortunate, because, the record book says he's a 7-time champion and he'll be going for 8 in 2020. And from that statistical standpoint, he's as good as Earnhardt and as good as Petty were in their eras. So this is a major, major retirement. And he had a bad 2019 season. I think there was some speculation whether or not that actually contributed to whether or not he stuck around. It could be. I don't really think Rick Hendrick is really a Roger Penske type who's going to shove a driver out of the door, especially considering what we're about to talk about here is who is the first in the line of succession, because there really isn't. I don't really see a guy who's Jimmie Johnson caliber to step into that 48 car right now. Now, I ran a poll on Twitter that threw a couple of names out there. I think the first one, and the one that actually ended up winning the poll, is Kyle Larson. Obviously, he's had experience in Hendrick equipment. Chip Ganassi ran it for quite a few years before they started building their own stuff. so he knows how to drive Hendrick equipment. He's kind of cut from that Jeff Gordon mold, very similar upbringing from a racing standpoint, very similar skill set, and a lot of times he drives a lot like Jeff Gordon. So I think from that perspective, Kyle Larson would be a good fit. It's going to depend whether or not Rick Hendrick wants to pay him. Then you start to look at some of the Xfinity drivers. You look at Ross Chastain. There's a potential there, even though he's with Ganassi. And then you would think, hey, maybe that would be an opportunity for Larson to move over to Hendrick, and then Ross Chastain moves over to Ganassi full-time. Then you look at Junior Motorsports, and you look at guys like Michael Annett. You look at Justin Allgaier. You look at Noah Gragson. And you look at Daniel Hemrick. I mean, that's there's four potentials there. I mean, obviously, if you're looking at the money aspect of it, you look at Michael Annett. I know Kamikaze Games would be very hard on the Justin Allgaier train, but I think it's much more likely that it's going to be a Daniel Hemrick or it's going to be a Noah Gragson. It just kind of depends how they perform next year. And, of course, there's the other question, Tyler Reddick maybe. Could Tyler Reddick kind of move into this conversation as well because of the fact that, of course, he doubled up on his championships this year in the Xfinity Series? At what point is someone going to give him a serious shot at Cup? Which I don't think they've announced that yet. Have they? Have they announced that? I can't even remember. I know that was a rumor. Never mind. I'm sure the comments section will let me know, or I'll just cut this part of the video. Because I know he was supposed to replace Hemrick, but I don't think they've announced that yet. I'm sorry, I've been sick for a week and a half, so I can't remember. Regardless, let's go back to talking about Jimmie a little bit more, because there's some potential that Jimmie is, or not just potential, but it's pretty much been explicitly stated by Jimmie that he is not totally done with racing. So what does that mean? Well, Bob Pockrass reported on Twitter a couple of days ago that pretty much everything and anything is open for Jimmie Johnson except for Indy cars on high-speed ovals. So no Indy 500, but we do know that Jimmie Johnson has stated in the past that he has interest in running Indy cars on a road course. So there's a potential there. I think the Rolex 24 is something that Jimmie Johnson has stated in the past that he would absolutely like to do. So I think endurance sports car racing is something that we could see Jimmie Johnson step into. I don't see a reason that he wouldn't try some Xfinity races or some truck races if he has a stock car racing fix at some point. It's going to be kind of fun to see what happens with Jimmie Johnson in his post-career, and certainly it's a well-earned retirement from the perspective of how much he's accomplished in his career in NASCAR. I don't know. What do you think? Who's going to take his seat, and where will he end up post-NASCAR Cup career? So what's old is new again, and Michael Andretti, in a report from Racer.com, has suggested that IndyCar move back to a franchise model that was popular during the kart era of IndyCar racing. Now, this is something that needs to be talked about a lot, because you almost heard me Freudian slip there, because essentially Michael Andretti is suggesting a charter system for IndyCar, which of course is used in NASCAR Cup racing right now. And one of the quotes that he used in this article is going to set me off here in just a second, because I need to talk about this. Now, this is directly from the article. Andretti says, when in regards to talking about value for teams, he says, any Joe Blow can buy a car and truck and show up at the racetrack. It's too easy, if that makes sense. There's got to be a way to make franchises, the 22 to 24 franchises, worth something. He continued. That's very problematic, to say the least, especially if you've been following this channel for any amount of time. You will know my stance on racing, especially in the era of racing where things seem to be contracting, things are getting smaller, there's less people involved in racing. We shouldn't be gatekeeping. We should not be keeping people out. We should not be becoming some exclusive country club. Racing should not be that, especially in this era. Racing should be open. Come on, come one, come all. If you can make it to the track, if you can buy a race car, if you can buy a transporter, you should be at the racetrack. And this is the thing that really made me scratch my head, because he just added Michael Shank to his team. Perhaps he should have asked Mr. Shank how difficult it was for him to make it to the track, I'm sure it was a hell of a lot more complicated than just buying a race car and a transporter and showing up at the racetrack. Talking specifically once again about the quote, the talk about franchises. We're going to get into that a lot more, but specifically, there's this talk about 22 to 24 franchises, or that's the idea. And that right now, as a car owner, you don't have value if you're in one of the 22 or 24 full-time racing entries. This is not true. There's a thing called the leader circle, and I'm sure I don't have to explain that to Micheal Andretti. He's well aware of that, but I need to explain it to some of you who maybe don't understand quite the business aspect of IndyCar racing. Each team owner who enters a car for the entire season, whether or not they qualify for the Indy 500, by the way, all they have to do is make an attempt. If they get bumped, they still get their leader circle money because they still showed up. But each entry that, qualifies, for the entire season between the top 21 or top 22, however many leader circle entries IndyCar decides to hand out that year, gets a guaranteed $1.5 million. Now, one of the things that this kind of has affected throughout IndyCar racing's history recently is that the prize money from races is significantly reduced. That's one of the side effects of this leader circle bonus. It's essentially you're showing up to each race and you get a big payout at the end of the year. But essentially, the infrastructure exists for a franchise model right now because essentially they're doing it without doing it. One of the things that I think Micheal Andretti is looking for here is something similar to what was done in kart, where in kart, team owners bought a franchise. The racing wasn't exclusively to franchisees, similar to the charter system in NASCAR. You could show up at a kart race without a charter, so to speak, and race, but you didn't get a vote in the future of the sport. And in fact, one of the things that split up IndyCar racing was the fact that Tony George, who was not a car owner but obviously owned the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, felt that one vote for the Indianapolis Motor Speedway on the kart board wasn't enough and wanted more of a say in the direction of IndyCar racing, which kart then said, no thank you, you get your one vote or get out, and Tony got out. So you can see the slippery slope where we start to get. But here's where things get really slippery. And we've talked about this on the channel for the better part of a year. We're going to talk about it again. Guaranteed entries. Then this is a step to having a 24-car Indy 500. And that's as far... you look at NASCAR, and sure, they're able to fill fields at tracks that are closer to North Carolina. Some of the bigger events, like the Daytona 500, they'll probably always get 40 cars for that. Of course, I could stick my foot in my mouth and they'll have 38, 39 cars next year. But essentially, what the NASCAR owners have wanted and what the NASCAR owners have essentially gotten is a country club where you either pay the piper or you don't get to race. And to me, that is the complete antithesis of what the Indianapolis 500 should be and always has been. It's a race where, sure, you can have the big fish like McLaren and Penske and Andretti, and you go back and you say the Granatellis or the Newman Haas's or whatever, the Fords, the Ferraris, everybody who gets to enter the Indy 500. But you also get the guys who build their cars in a barn, or like what we saw with Ricardo Juncos this year, where the guy throws all his money into buying a brand new chassis. They build that car up. They go pretty fast with a second-year American driver, Kyle Kaiser. Kaiser hits the wall with that car. They have to pull a road course car out of the hauler and rebuild that car using some of the parts that weren't completely destroyed. They put that car on the track. They go out there and they qualify for the Indy 500. And oh, by the way, they knocked one of the big fish out, which was, of course, McLaren. So Micheal Andretti in that Joe Blow quote pretty clearly lays out what he wants IndyCar racing to be, and he wants it to be a country club. He wants there to be 24 people. Doesn't matter about the quality so much. It just matters whether or not they're getting paid. And this is professional auto racing. This is my opinion. It's not SCCA. If you want to go club racing, that is available. That is out there. That is out there right now. But I think fans of IndyCar racing, and I think team owners that aren't named Micheal Andretti or Chip Ganassi or Roger Penske, pretty much everybody else wouldn't mind seeing 45 cars show up for the Indy 500. We don't mind seeing 28 cars show up at St. Petersburg. To me, these are positive things. And I'm not saying you can't make the sport more stable and you can't make there be more value for the car owners. I don't want to be misinterpreted here. I don't think Micheal Andretti should be doing this as a charity case. I don't think he should not be a businessman coming into racing. I think he should make some money. Absolutely. Why wouldn't he? Why shouldn't he? My point is that Micheal Andretti should not be advocating to make IndyCar racing exclusive, because that's exactly the problem that ultimately was CART's Achilles heel. It was too exclusive. It didn't have enough new blood coming into it. So when the old blood found that they needed to be at the Indianapolis 500 rather than run the CART series, suddenly you had a 19-car grid and nobody was left because there was no new blood left. And the few car owners that were still around had to put all their money back into the series, and then nobody was making any money at that point. So this is frustrating because, especially, and I've said it a couple times about the Indy 500 and the qualifying there. Why would you change if you're worried about losing money and the series as a whole is losing you money? Why would you want to change the one event that works? The Indy 500. The Indy 500 qualifications are a big part of why that event has such lore and such mystique, and why 300,000 people show up to that race. Again, I don't mind you trying to fix the other events, because those are clearly where you're losing money. And there's a possibility that you could create a franchise system in IndyCar that isn't exclusionary. I think you could probably do it. I think there's nothing wrong with adding value for the team owners. I think that's a fine and noble idea. My concern is you don't want to make it exclusive, because that's where things begin to fall apart. So that's been This Week in Racing. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know down in the comments what you think, and I will see you in the next video.